The longest war for America ended with the U.S. leaving Afghanistan. Many media groups used strong words to describe this event: botched, betrayal, and a chaotic retreat. Reports showed an uncomfortable truth about what happened. Public opinion polls showed that 50% of Americans thought the war in Afghanistan was a big mistake. Also, 61% of Americans did not approve of how the U.S. managed the leaving process. Before the troops left, the White House made hopeful statements. They said things like, "The Taliban taking over everything will not happen." They also promised the withdrawal would not be hasty and would be done responsibly and safely. President Joe Biden even called the mission an extraordinary success. However, he later had to change these words because of much criticism. The reality was very different. Soldiers who saw it all called the event a catastrophe. These soldiers had risked their lives. They had seen bodies ripped apart in terrorist attacks. They saw the body parts of victims mixed in razor wire. They witnessed their own friends, fellow soldiers, blown to pieces. They also saw large groups of desperate Afghan citizens trying to escape. These crowds were dangerous, with adults suffocating and screaming children in their arms. Many children quickly became orphans. One soldier, a tough veteran, said, "I've never seen anything like it." He, like many others, wondered how the powerful U.S. military could be forced out by poorly armed men who looked more like farmers. Many people asked a central question: was it all worth it? One commentator asked about the human cost: 2,500 American dead, 20,000 injured, $1 trillion or more spent, and for what? As this story will show, the true cost was closer to $2 trillion. The final leaving from Afghanistan was a time of immense chaos, filled with bravery, but also with terrible savagery and deadly mistakes. It became a nightmare. This is the full story of America's longest war. 2. The Taliban's start. After the Soviet Union left Afghanistan in the early 1990s, the country was not peaceful. Many rebel groups called Mujahideen had fought the Soviets. But now these groups were separate and often fought each other. There was much disorder and fighting across Afghanistan. From these groups, one new power began to grow stronger: the Taliban. The word Taliban means students in the Pashto language. Most of these men were farmers or had studied Islam in religious schools in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They promised to bring back order and peace after years of war. They said they would rule the country based on strict Islamic law called Sharia. By the year 1996, the Taliban had taken control of most of Afghanistan. In 1997, they took the capital city, Kabul. By 1998, they controlled about 90% of the country. Many people at first welcomed the Taliban. Roads became safer and trade started again. People were happy to see less corruption. They liked the promise of stability. However, the Taliban's rule was very harsh. They brought brutal punishments, like cutting off hands for theft or beheadings for other serious crimes. They took away many human rights. Women were especially oppressed. In the 1970s, Afghanistan, especially cities like Kabul, was much more modern. Women could go to university, work, and wear Western clothes, like short skirts. They walked freely with their hair uncovered. But the Taliban changed everything. They banned television, movies, and music. Women were told they could not study after the age of 8. They were not allowed to work or leave their homes without a male family member. Women had to cover themselves completely with a burqa. If they did not follow these rules, they could be whipped in public. One time, a woman's finger was cut off for wearing nail polish. Educated and modern people found this new rule very difficult. The Taliban might have brought some order to a troubled nation, but they also brought old and cruel ways of life, especially for women. Many people fled Afghanistan, while others joined groups that resisted the Taliban. 3. The Big Attack. In 1999, the United Nations Security Council made an important decision. They created Resolution 1267, which put sanctions on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. This was because the Taliban was giving help and shelter to the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. The UN's actions aimed to stop their funding, arms shipments, and international travel. On September 9, 2001, a significant event happened. Ahmad Shah Massoud, a well-known Afghan military commander, was killed. He had fought against the Soviets and later led forces against the Taliban. Osama bin Laden, the infamous leader of Al-Qaeda, was behind this attack. Bin Laden deeply hated Western influence and believed that American actions justified attacks on civilians. He was already a very dangerous and wanted terrorist by the FBI. Just 2 days later, on September 11, 2001, the world faced a terrible tragedy. Al-Qaeda terrorists took control of 4 commercial airplanes in the United States. They deliberately crashed 2 planes into the iconic World Trade Center towers in New York City, which then collapsed. Another plane hit the Pentagon, a military building in Washington, D.C., and the 4th plane crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 innocent people lost their lives in these coordinated attacks. The American people were left in deep shock and immense sadness. The entire world watched these events unfold with great disbelief. President George W. Bush spoke to the grieving nation with a very serious message. He stated that America's freedom and way of life had come under direct attack through these deadly terrorist acts. President Bush promised that the United States would stand strong, defend freedom, and find all those responsible for such horrific crimes. It quickly became clear that Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network were indeed behind these attacks. With the Taliban accused of hiding bin Laden, this terrible day directly led to the start of the United States' long war in Afghanistan. 4. The war starts. After the September 11 attacks, news reports said the Taliban openly admitted they were hiding Osama bin Laden. Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, an ambassador for Kabul, clearly stated that bin Laden was under their control for his safety. This was a significant change, as the Taliban had earlier claimed they did not know where he was located. The spiritual leader of the Taliban, Mullah Muhammad Omar, then made defiant statements on television. He called Americans cowardly, saying they lacked the courage to come to Afghanistan. He even spoke about the destruction of America, hoping the country would fall to the ground. These strong words greatly angered many Americans, who were still in mourning and seeking justice after the recent attacks. The U.S. population felt a strong need for revenge, or at least a clear response. President George W. Bush quickly addressed the public. He promised that the U.S. would win the war against terrorism. He then delivered a clear demand to the Taliban. They must hand over all the leaders of al-Qaeda who were hiding in their land to United States authorities. When the Taliban refused, the war began. On October 6, 2001, the U.S. military, with strong support from the United Kingdom, started bombing Taliban forces. This action officially launched a military campaign called Operation Enduring Freedom. Other Western countries, including Australia, Canada, France, and Germany, also announced they would join the fight. These international allies worked closely with local Afghan groups that opposed the Taliban, such as the Northern Alliance and other ethnic Pashtun forces. The Westerners knew little about Afghanistan and sometimes even used old maps. The Taliban regime was quickly defeated by these combined forces. By November and December of 2001, the Taliban's power crumbled. Their fighters surrendered in Kandahar, and their leader, Mullah Omar, went into hiding. Other al-Qaeda leaders also disappeared from public view. With the Taliban seemingly gone, there was great hope for Afghanistan's future. In April 2002, President Bush announced a plan to rebuild the country. He spoke of creating an Afghanistan free from the Taliban's harsh rule and a better place for everyone. The U.S. Congress agreed to set aside $38 billion for humanitarian aid and reconstruction efforts, planned to be spent until 2009. Work on rebuilding began, and many American businesses secured large contracts. There was much optimism among many Americans that the country could be transformed. In May 2003, U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld even declared that major combat in Afghanistan had ended. However, this costly reconstruction effort was just the beginning of a much longer and harder period. 5. A long, hard fight. In May 2003, the U.S. Secretary of Defense said that major combat in Afghanistan had finished. This seemed like good news at the time. However, the war was far from over, and more challenges lay ahead. By 2006, the Taliban started to get strong again. There were many attacks across the country, causing problems for the UN coalition. These attacks continued for years. In 2009, the new U.S. President, Barack Obama, decided to send more troops. He sent 17,000 more soldiers to Afghanistan to fight against the growing Taliban presence. By August of that year, between 60,000 and 68,000 U.S. troops were involved in operations. A big event happened in May 2011. U.S. forces killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. This was an important moment in the fight against terrorism. However, over time, many Americans began to question the war. Polls showed that most Americans no longer wanted their soldiers in Afghanistan. People were dying, and the war was very expensive. It cost a lot to fight and to try and rebuild a country that, to some extent, did not fully want the U.S. there. Many Americans openly criticized the U.S. presence. Some even said they did not know why U.S. soldiers were still in Afghanistan. Fighting the Taliban was also very hard. The Taliban had strong support from many local people. More Afghans were willing to fight and die for the Taliban than for the government. Many believed the Taliban were true Afghans and Muslims fighting a holy war. They saw the foreign soldiers as invaders. The foreign soldiers did not speak the local languages and often did not understand Afghan customs well. This made the fight very difficult. The war became a stalemate. It was hard to win, but it was also hard to just leave. The U.S. and its allies had created a difficult situation. Many people around the world wanted the troops to leave soon. In 2015, President Obama reduced the number of U.S. troops to 10,000. This was a big change from 100,000 in 2011. In 2017, the strength of the Taliban grew more. The U.S. used its most powerful non-nuclear bomb against ISIS fighters. President Donald Trump called this attack very, very successful. However, even then, the U.S. military said the war with the Taliban was a stalemate. The war was long and hard. It was clear that the American public was tired of it. Withdrawal became necessary, but it would not be easy. 6. The plan to leave. In 2019, peace talks with the Taliban began. The main idea was that the Taliban would promise to stop terrorists from operating in Afghanistan. By the end of 2019, reports said the U.S. would pull out around 7,000 troops. In March 2020, the U.S. military and the Taliban signed a peace agreement. However, the Taliban quickly started many attacks against Afghan forces across different areas. Later in 2020, the Taliban and the Afghan government met in Qatar to talk about a plan for peace and how to govern Afghanistan in the future. On April 14, 2021, President Joe Biden made a big announcement. He said that all U.S. troops would leave Afghanistan by May 1st. He said it was time to end America's longest war. This idea of ending forever wars was something former President Donald Trump had also spoken about. NATO troops, who had fought alongside the U.S., would also leave. The war had been very expensive and had cost many lives. Over $2.3 trillion were spent. Thousands of people died on all sides. This included 2,324 U.S. military personnel and 3,917 U.S. contractors. More than 66,000 Afghan security forces, over 52,000 Taliban fighters, and more than 46,000 Afghan civilians also lost their lives. Many non-U.S. NATO soldiers, especially from Britain, Canada, and France, and many Pakistani people were also killed. President Biden's announcement sent a shockwave through Afghanistan. The White House had talked about the possibility of the security situation getting worse quickly. They worried the Afghan government might collapse. However, no one truly expected how fast it would happen. As U.S. troops slowly began to pull out in May, the Taliban quickly started to take control. They seized different parts of the country, district by district, showing their strength. By August 14th, the Taliban controlled all of Afghanistan's borders. This meant Kabul airport was the only safe way for people to leave the country. Panic filled the streets of Kabul. People were very scared. The U.S. Department of State told American citizens and their partners in Afghanistan to find safe places and wait for instructions. Many Afghans, especially women who had jobs or were studying, did not want to live under the strict rules of the Taliban again. They feared for their lives and freedoms. Many had waited outside the embassy for weeks, hoping to get a visa. As the Taliban surrounded the capital, Kabul, it felt like a giant, dangerous storm was about to hit the city. Everyone knew their lives were about to change forever. 7. Chaos at the airport. When the Taliban took over Kabul, many people felt great fear. The city's airport became the only way for them to leave Afghanistan. Thousands of desperate people rushed there. They ignored calls to stay away and pushed towards the airport gates, hoping to get on a plane. Many had helped Americans or did not want to live under Taliban rule again. They waved papers, hoping to show they could leave. American and British soldiers were at the airport. Their job was to help people leave, but the crowds were too big. Soldiers struggled to keep people from running onto the runways. Helicopters flew low to try and move the crowds back. Troops fired warning shots, rubber bullets, and tear gas. It was hard to see who was a civilian and who might be a threat. People cried and shouted, squeezed together in the heat. Heartbreaking scenes happened. People were crushed in stampedes, and dead bodies lay on the ground, some of them children. A large military plane, a C-17, landed. Many people ran onto the runway and tried to climb onto the moving plane. Some held on for a short time, but as the plane took off, they fell to the ground. Later, human remains were found in the plane's wheels. Parents passed their babies over the tall fences, hoping soldiers would take them to safety. One baby was passed hand to hand through the crowd and saved. The situation grew worse, with new threats. Both U.S. forces and the Taliban received information that ISIS, another extremist group, was planning an attack. To manage the danger, the American troops made a difficult agreement. The Taliban would help control the crowds and security outside the airport. The U.S. forces would handle security inside. Many soldiers found it hard to work with the Taliban, their old enemies. Sadly, the warnings were true. On August 26th, a huge explosion happened outside the Abbey Gate, one of the airport entrances. It was a suicide bomb attack by ISIS. The blast killed many people. 13 American service members died, and about 170 Afghans also lost their lives. Body parts were scattered everywhere, and the water in a nearby canal turned red with blood. There was total chaos, with confusion and more gunfire. Witnesses described it as terrible carnage. Days later, more tragedy struck. The U.S. military launched a drone strike against a vehicle they believed carried ISIS members. Officials first said it was a good strike, but later investigations showed the military was wrong. The car belonged to an aid worker. The strike killed 10 innocent civilians, including 7 children. This mistake added to the pain and criticism of the withdrawal. 8. The war is over. The last American soldier left Afghanistan on August 30, 2021. Major General Chris Donahue was the last to go. His plane left just before midnight. The 20-year war was over. The next day, the Taliban entered the airport. They celebrated their victory. They saw how the Americans had destroyed things. One fighter said, "What a mess." Another felt the U.S. had oppressed them, and now it was the end. President Joe Biden said the war was over. He called the mission an extraordinary success. Many did not agree. 124,000 people were evacuated. This was a great logistical achievement, but for the war, it was a failure. After the U.S. left, Afghanistan had big problems. The economy collapsed. Many people became poor. There was a humanitarian crisis. The Taliban's strict rule returned, especially hurting women. Do you think the long war in Afghanistan was worth its great cost?
Hey there! Just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really, really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world. Thank you.